This presentation on Asian American racial identity development theory was developed by Carmen Barnhart, Kelly Guerrero, and Andrea Heracopis, and based on the chapter in our textbook, New Perspectives on Racial Identity Development. The objective of this presentation is to familiarize you with John Kim's Asian American racial identity development theory. As you go through the presentation, we'd like for you to think about your relationships with Asian American students, friends, and colleagues, and how your cultural and racial identity intersects with theirs. While an individual's identity is made up of multiple components, viewing race as a single identity is a common practice when discussing racial identity development. Before we dive into the AARID theory, we want to introduce the participant to some terms and ideas to create a foundation for us, then to discuss the theory. Our identity is made up of several intersecting dimensions, with race being but one of them. Race, however, is an important dimension because it is how people within and outside that race view the members of a particular racial group. Race, then, is a social identity. It also carries with it varying status within our society. How an individual's self-esteem will be enhanced by identifying with one's racial group is influenced by the status or prestige of that group. Racial identity development describes how people within a particular race deal with the effects of racism. Over time, individuals must learn to refuse the views of the dominant member's race and create their own positive views of membership in their own race. Race, as an identity, is a socially designated group. Ethnicity is the culture, traditions, and customs of a group of people. Ethnicity, particularly for Asian American people, is related to their country of origin and the expectations that go along with membership in the ethnic group. While racial and ethnic groups both have varying status within society, ethnic groups are not so closely tied to oppression and racism. Ethnic identity develops through the tension between how an individual is expected to be in relationship to cultural expectations and values and how the person wants to be viewed as ethnic. As an individual, an Asian American can accept or reject different aspects of these cultural expectancies or values. Tension occurs when there is a difference between the cultural expectations of the group and the individual's ideals and desired perception of being a group member. Conflict surfaces when an individual comes in contact with people outside the ethnic group, which leads the individual to realize that he or she is part of the minority status. If the individual feels rejected by the majority group, he or she may attempt to identify with the majority. Finney's 1989 study of adolescents found that compared to African Americans and Hispanics, more Asian Americans would change their race to white if they could. Race is both socially and politically determined. The critical race theory states that race is determined by social and political practices and not simply by the color of one's skin. Racial prejudice occurs with inaccurate or negative beliefs that rationalize that one's race is superior or normal compared to another race. Racial dominance is the predominant race that is in control in society. Racism, then, occurs when racial prejudice and racial dominance occur simultaneously. For example, a group of young children playing on the playground may have a white racial dominance, but as long as their parents have not passed along their racial prejudice, the children all play together without anyone experiencing racism. Most commonly, we think of racism as a black-white issue, but racism occurs in all minority racial groups. Racism for Asian Americans take place in the form of being referred to as the model minority, an idea that they come to America and keep their head down and work hard. They are not making trouble or getting in the way. This is the white view of the right thing to do if you are a minority in the U.S. Asian Americans are often said to be good at math and technology nerds. While these attributes seem positive, they are nonetheless stereotypes that many Asian Americans face. These stereotypes are played out over and over in movies and television. For example, in the movie The Martian, the brave astronaut is a white male. His crew is a mixed group of men and women devoid of an Asian American. However, back at NASA, an Asian American heads the engineering division. In one scene, this Asian American man makes a joke referring to someone in China as his cousin Lee. This is just one example of how film is reinforcing stereotypes. While many people might think Asian Americans haven't experience true racism, history provides us with evidence of violence and discrimination, including internment camps in this country in the 1940s during World War II. Asian Americans certainly look different than the white majority, and in this country, unfortunately, different is often associated with inferiority. For minorities like Asian Americans, often they are thought of as being Asian first, then American only second. The saliency of one's race and ethnicity depends on the social context and can vary between different situations. For example, individuals may identify more with their ethnicity when with family, but then identify more with their race when interacting with a majority group, for example, at work or school. The saliency of one's race also depends on the stage one is at in his or her development. An individual might focus more on personal identities, being a parent, a doctor, or a daughter. Depending on other events occurring in one's life, personal identities may overshadow racial or ethnic identity. These might be more salient, or an individual may be avoiding dealing with the social realities of his or her racial membership. Compartmentalizing occurs when social identities come into conflict. For example, Asian Americans who are gay might keep their sexual orientation identity separate from their racial or ethnic identity due to a stronger bias against homosexuality within their culture. Suppression of Asian American racial identity development may occur in the immigrant generation, since assimilation into a new country is more important. In addition, many of these new immigrants are coming to this country after their formative years, so their identities have been established and the effects of the majority race and culture have less of an effect on their personal identity. Group orientation is when a person is responsive to external expectations. This includes expectations within their racial and ethnic group, as well as expectations from their social environment. Group orientation means that individuals are more externally focused than internally focused, being shaped more by outside forces than internal forces while developing their identity. Acculturation is the process of adopting the cultural traits or social patterns of another group. This is where Asian Americans reject the Asian aspects or attributes in favor of white aspects or attributes. Negative racial identity is devaluing one's racial self. This leads to a rejection of identity as Asians and can go as far as expressing the desire to become white. Negative racial identity leads to low self-esteem. Now, we will go through each stage of the theory. There are 5 stages included in this theory: ethnic awareness, white identification, awakening to social political consciousness, redirection to Asian American consciousness, and incorporation. The first stage, ethnic awareness, begins before the child has entered school. At this stage, the child gains their ethnic awareness from interactions with family members and others in their environment. If they live in a neighborhood which is predominantly Asian, they will be exposed to more ethnic activities and therefore develop greater ethnic pride and knowledge about their culture. On the other hand, those who grow up in a predominantly white neighborhood tend to feel neutral about their ethnic membership because they haven't been exposed to as much of their culture. When children have more exposure to Asian ethnic experiences, they tend to have a more positive self-concept and clearer ego identity. The second stage is white identification. This stage comes about from negative experiences that the person has gone through, such as name-calling or being made fun of in school. Through these experiences, they realize that they are different from their white peers. In an attempt to avoid these negative experiences, they try to fit in with the white culture. There are 2 types of white identification: active and passive. Asian Americans who grew up in predominantly white environments experience the active white identification. They tend to feel closely identified with white culture and do not see as many differences between the cultures. However, for those who grew up in Asian or mixed neighborhoods, they may fantasize about being more white, but relate more to their own culture and recognize the difference between their culture and the white culture. Both types of white identification are brought about by negative experiences and opinions of themselves as Asian Americans. When an Asian American truly believes they can fit into the white society and not be seen as different, they get stuck in this stage. In the stage of awakening to social political consciousness, Asian Americans have a more realistic sense of the social and political atmosphere and have less of a desire to fit in with white society. Before this stage, Asian Americans feel like the negative experiences they have had were their fault. During this stage, they come to the realization that society is to blame for these negative situations. Now, Asian Americans see white people as an example of what they do not want to be. In the stage of redirection to an Asian American consciousness, Asian Americans develop a desire to learn more about their culture and develop more positive feelings about themselves. As they become more educated about their own culture, they may start to feel anger towards the predominantly white society and acts of racism they have seen or experienced. This stage is about developing racial pride and a positive self-concept. Incorporation is the final stage. Here, Asian Americans have developed a positive self-concept and learned more about their own history and culture. The result of this is that they are able and willing to be around various racial groups without feeling the need to change themselves to fit in. In addition, they realize that racial identity is important, but it is only one of the many identities they have. They begin to assimilate their social identities with their racial identity. Now that you're familiar with how the theory is constructed, we'll discuss the theory's strengths and criticism, the relevance of the theory today, as well as proposed variations of this model. When talking about the relevance of this theory, we need to keep in mind that other factors, some of which are listed here, influence identity development as well. As we mentioned previously, race may not be the most salient factor for Asian Americans. This is partially due to the model minority myth. The model minority myth was briefly mentioned earlier. Understanding this myth is important to the relevance of this theory. The model minority myth began in the mid-1960s when the media began depicting Asian Americans as the model minority. There were popular magazine articles which combined positive generalizations with the negative stereotypes of Asian Americans and portrayed Asian Americans as the minority group that had made it to this country due to their hard work. The myth encourages Asian Americans to believe that they can be fully accepted into white society and can be more privileged than the other minorities by acting more white. The myth doesn't take into account the cost of acculturating into white society, but by believing in this myth, Asian Americans can overlook the racial discrimination they face, so race may not be the most salient factor in their development. There are several variations that apply to the theory as well. The first is from Ye and Wong in 1996. They considered the theory to be too constrictive and individually focused. They suggested that because Asian Americans are more focused on collectivism than individualism, and due to the desire to avoid shame and conform to group standards, Asian Americans might be more willing to conform to mainstream American beliefs than develop their own identity. The second variation is from Say in 1999. He analyzed 39 published stories from Asian Americans and came up with two substages in the stage development model. These substages are found within Stage 4 of the model, Reawakening to Asian American Consciousness, and they deal with Asian Americans becoming more conscious of their own experiences, discovering more knowledge about their heritage and culture, and they begin to immerse themselves in the Asian American experience. The last variation is from Chen and Guzman in 2003. They thought that since race is not always the most salient factor in identity development, a multidimensional model that takes more than one factor into account might be a better model for Asian Americans. The example you heard earlier of keeping sexual identity separate from racial identity in the case of homosexual Asian Americans would be applicable here, since sexual orientation might be a more salient factor than race. Some critiques of this theory include the fact that it doesn't apply to all Asian Americans. It primarily applies to what is referred to as the 1.5 generation, or people who were born in Asia but primarily raised in the U.S. The theory doesn't seem as relevant for people who immigrate as adults. These people do not go through the earlier stages in this model because they do not spend their childhood here. The theory doesn't take into account the marriage patterns of Asian Americans. More Asian Americans are marrying out of their racial group and marrying black or white partners, or marrying out of their Asian ethnic group, for example, a Chinese American marrying a Korean American partner. The theory doesn't take into account for the experiences of interracial or interethnic people. The theory also doesn't take into account the increasing number of Asian children who are adopted by white families. Since the 80s, this has become an increasing trend, and it's not really clear whether these Asian ethnic children who are being raised by white families can relate to the AARID or not. This will be an area for future research. Some strengths of the theory include that many Asian Americans who were primarily raised in the U.S. still find the stages representative of their own experiences, so it remains relevant today. The theory also keeps race and ethnicity separate, which is important since most Asian Americans identify more with race than ethnicity. The theory takes into account collectivism and those group experiences which are so important in Asian American culture. When Asian Americans have developed through all the stages, they end with a positive racial identity and have confidence in their Asian American identity. This allows them to blend racial identity with the rest of their social identities. After watching our presentation, we hope you have a good overview of the 5 stages of the AARID. We also discussed the key concepts of race versus ethnicity, saliency, collectivism, and the model minority myth, in order for you to have a basic understanding of those terms and how they apply to the AARID. Something else to think about is how understanding this theory could apply to your own work, or especially how it can improve student affairs work. For this week's discussion, we ask that you reply to one of these 3 questions that relate to the AARID model in our work with students. The first question, are there parts of this theory that apply to your own cultural racial identity? The second question, this theory states that some can get stuck in the white identification stage. What can we do as student affairs professionals to help them move past the notion that they need to fit in with the white culture? And number 3, given that Asian Americans are group-oriented, how can student affairs foster the development of these students?